Hi there, my name's Ellie. I'm an assistant psychologist at the private therapy clinic, and today I'm going to be talking about a very well-known study in the history of psychology. Many of you may already be familiar with this, especially if you've studied psychology A-level. So the experiment I'm going to be talking about is Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. The study was conducted by a very well-known psychologist, Dr. Phillip Zimbardo, and it took place in the basement floor of the Stanford University. The experiment was looking to see the psychological effects of becoming either a guard or a prisoner. To make the study as real as possible and to create the simulated prison, they called upon the help of a real-life prisoner. And to do this, they boarded up either end of a corridor in the basement of Stanford University. They called this corridor area the yard, where prisoners were able to eat, exercise, walk when they were outside of their cells. To create the cells, they removed laboratory doors from 2 rooms and replaced these with real-life prison cell doors, and they added beds. They also had a cupboard which they called the hole, which was solitary confinement. So when a bad prisoner misbehaved, they would put them in there for punishment. They also would blindfold prisoners on the way to the toilet so that they did not know how to leave all the way out. They also made a hole in one of the boards at one of the ends of the corridors in which they added a camera so that they could film things that were happening. They also had an intercom in which they could speak to the prisoners and the guards and give orders, and they could also hear the prisoners and the guards' interactions. So this was just a few ways that they made the prison feel like a real prison. To recruit participants for this study, an ad was placed in the local newspaper calling on volunteers for a study on the psychological effects of the prison environment. There were 70 applicants who were placed through diagnostic interviews and personality tests just to eliminate anyone with medical disabilities or psychological problems. So they were left with 24 healthy young male adults who were in the Stanford area from the US and Canada. To decide which became guards and which participants became prisoners, a coin was flipped so that it was completely random and there was no bias on which role participant was given. The guards, on the other hand, were given no specific training for their roles. They were allowed to behave however they felt fit and within their means to keep order within the prison, and they were given uniforms which were khaki sort of guard uniforms, and they were given whistles to wear around their neck. And this was just to make them more anonymous. They were also given sunglasses that were mirrored to hide their eyes. And when people start to feel anonymous, they are more likely to behave in a way that they wouldn't if they were able to be seen by others. Also meant that prisoners couldn't see their eyes and read their emotions. As with real life prisoners, all of the study prisoners did expect to have some form of harassment, to have their privacy and some of their rights violated, and to have not the best of diets, and this was all stuff that they consented to when they volunteered. On the first day of the study, there were 9 guards and 9 prisoners, and the guards worked in 8-hour shifts. The rest of the guards that weren't working were on call in case anything happened in the prison. And the first night of the experiment, the guards woke the prisoners up at 2:30 AM for counts, which is where they had to read out their numbers, and it was sort of a way of familiarising the prisoners with their numbers, and also a way for the guards to exert control over the prisoners. At first, the guards were still sort of getting a feel for their roles, and the prisoners were still sort of finding it funny by laughing and giggling, and the guards then escalated and made the prisoners do push-ups as a way of asserting authority over the prisoners, and they would even go as far as putting a leg on the prisoners as they were doing push-ups, or getting another prisoner to sit on the prisoner as they were doing push-ups. And this is also later found to be very similar to some of the behaviour of the guards during Nazi Germany. Interestingly, on the morning of the second day, a rebellion broke out within the prisoners. They ripped off their numbers and their stocking caps, and they barricaded themselves inside the cells, which really angered the guards, and they also obviously felt a bit more confident with their upper hand, and they were shouting, cursing at the guards, which angered them even more. So they called in reinforcements from the other guards that were on call. So all 9 guards were there, and they decided together to use the fire extinguishers that were there to spray carbon dioxide into the cells to make the prison run back to the back of the cells. They then proceeded to break down the barriers, and they got into the cells. They stripped all of the prisoners naked, and they took the ringleaders of the rebellion and put them in solitary confinement. So this was quite a big reaction to the rebellion, and the issue that they then found was they couldn't have 9 guards in all the time, so what was to stop it happening again? So one of the guards came up with creating psychological effects rather than physical punishments. So they decided to set up a privileged cell and a non-privileged cell. To create a divide among the prisoners, the guards separated the prisoners to those that were least involved in the rebellion and those that were most involved, placed those that were least into their own cell, where they got special privileges, such as special foods they were allowed to eat when those that didn't have any privileges were on a temporary eating ban. They also allowed them to wash and brush their teeth whenever they liked, and to use the toilet all the time, whereas other prisoners didn't have this privilege. And this went on for about half a day, and then the guards decided to create even more of a divide and break the solidarity between the prisoners. They placed some of the good prisoners, the privileged ones, into the non-privileged cell, and some of the non-privileged into the privileged cell, which thoroughly confused the prisoners, and it meant that they ended up turning on each other and were distrustful of each other, because the non-privileged prisoners felt the privileged ones were informants for the guard, and it just completely broke the togetherness of the prisoners to make sure that another rebellion didn't happen. However, on the other side, this rebellion created solidarity between the guards. They became even more against the prisoners, and they stepped up their surveillance, their controlling. They saw the prisoners as troublemakers now due to the rebellion. The guards then began to control loads of aspects of the prisoners' lives, such as they would do a lights out at 10 p.m. and they would not be able to go to the toilet throughout the night. They placed a bucket in the prisoners' cells in which they had to urinate and sometimes they wouldn't even change these buckets, so that they would end up overflowing and the whole place would smell of urine and feces. And may I remind you that this is a psychological study, so it's mind-blowing that this was allowed to happen, and this does make it a very, very controversial study, but I will talk more about that later. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, prisoner 8612 began experiencing emotional disturbances and uncontrollable crying, disorganised thinking, rage. He was removed from the cells by the guards, and at first everyone was so involved in their roles that they thought that he was acting and that he was making up these feelings, so they said that he could go back in as an informant in exchange for no further harassment from the guards. They released him back into the cells, and it was during a count later on that prisoner 8612 started telling all the other prisoners, you can't leave, you can't quit, which further solidified the real prison feel for these other prisoners. He then had a breakdown and was shouting, cursing, had a big rage, and it was only then when the guards and researchers finally realised that this prisoner participant was really experiencing emotional disturbances from this, and they finally released him, which is crazy to think that it took 2 emotional breakdowns for them to believe that this participant was genuinely experiencing disturbance from the study. The day after this, the prison held visiting hours for the families of the boys who were prisoners, and they even made this as real as possible by making them register, making them wait when they got there, and only giving them a certain amount of time with each prisoner. And some of the families were so distressed to see their relative And some of the parents were so distressed to see their son so fatigued that they even conformed with the process of the prison and complained to the superintendent to try and get them better conditions, when it is just an experiment. So they could have easily pulled their sons out, but even they conformed to this idea that it was a real prison. The next major event to happen in the prison was this rumoured escape plot. So the prisoner that was released, 8612, he was rumoured to be coming back with some friends to break into the prison and release the prisoners, and the researchers and the guards became so involved in their roles. They truly believed this was going to happen and were trying to formulate a plan to stop this from happening. Zimbardo even went back to the police department that helped them originally to ask for reinforcements, but obviously this was out of their realm. So they came up with a second plan to move the prison up to the top floor of the university and dismantle the basement prison, so that when the ex-prisoner came with his friends to break them out, they would just tell them that the experiment was over. And during this, a fellow researcher came to see the prison and saw the extent, and even said to Zimbardo that this is crazy and that he's got too involved in the role. Zimbardo just sort of was said to sort of dismiss this, as he had an escape plan coming, so that he had bigger problems as this head guard. So he even got so involved in the role that he couldn't see the extent to which this study had not become a study anymore, and that it had become more like a real prison. And I think he'd lost sight of the variables and the research part of it. So this escape plan never materialised, and it turned out to just be a rumour, and this really angered the guards, as they'd spent the whole day planning for this escape that never happened, and they upped their punishments and took it out on the prisoners by making them do repetitive tasks like cleaning out toilet bowls with their bare hands, and just making them do absurd things. As the experiment continued, the line between real life and the simulation was completely blurred, and they even invited a priest to assess the realness of the prison, as this priest had worked in previous real life prisons. And even when speaking to him, the prisoners introduced themselves as their number rather than by name. And they also did things like they got a parole board in of other researchers to help them get parole to get out of the prison, and things like this just made it seem more and more realistic. And the study was only supposed to be 2 weeks long. One prisoner who was unable to speak to this priest was prisoner 819, who was really sick and wasn't eating, and he'd been taken to another room as he was also started to begin to have emotional disturbances and uncontrollable crying. Zimbardo took him to a separate room to lie down and rest for a bit, and while he was there, the guards made all the prisoners pants. Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner in unity, and this was no longer the fun chanting that was happening at the beginning. This was complete conformity from the prisoners. Zimbardo is said to have rushed back into the room where prisoner 819 was lying, and he was sobbing uncontrollably as he could just hear the chanting of the other prisoners. Zimbardo told him that he can leave, but he was so engulfed in his role as a prisoner that he said if he was to leave, that the other prisoners would think he's a bad prisoner. Zimbardo said, listen, that you're not a prisoner, this is just a study, and that we can go. By the 5th day, the guards had fully immersed themselves into these roles, and it was now becoming easy for them to be prison guards. It said that there were 3 types of guards. One type were fair but tough, so they followed prison rules but weren't as hostile as some of the others. There were guards described as the good guys, who would do small favours for the prisoners and wouldn't punish them. And there were the 3rd type, which were the hostile, inventive with their punishment type of guards, who were all about humiliating the prisoners and just quite harsh with them. So these harsh guards seem to really enjoy the power. None of the tests that they did beforehand, the personality tests, predicted this type of behaviour from these guards. As I said before, they were all average boys, all pretty similar. So the only link between personality and prison behaviour was seen in prisoners, where those with more of an authoritarian personality endured the authoritarian environment more than those without. So an authoritarian personality is described as a personality type of extreme obedience in situations of authority. Coping mechanisms shown by the prisoners differed. Some broke down, I think it was at least 4 broke down uncontrollably in these situations, while others, such as one prisoner, when he was told that he wouldn't be able to have parole, he broke out in a rash. Others would try and be good prisoners and do everything that the guards told them to do. But by the end of the study, prisoners were disintegrated, and the unity between them that was seen at the beginning was completely gone. They were just individuals who were trying to survive through this horrendous environment. The guards had totally gained control over every aspect of the prison. Although the guards had gained complete control over the prisoners and the prison, there was one final act of rebellion by prisoner 416. This prisoner was a later admission into the study to replace some of the prisoners that had left. He arrived in the midst of all of the chaos and the horrible living conditions. He wasn't a witness to the gradual harassment and the gradual humiliation and punishments. And in reaction to this, he went on a hunger strike because he really wanted to leave. And he'd been told by the prisoners that you can't leave and that it was a real prison. So he decided to go on hunger strike, and the guards tried everything to try and get him to eat. He wouldn't, so they ended up placing him in solitary confinement for hours, and they ended up asking the other prisoners whether they would give up their blankets to get their fellow prisoner out of solitary confinement, or keep their blankets and leave the prisoner 416 in there all night. And the prisoners decided to keep their blankets, which was quite an interesting development, which shows that the unity that was there in the beginning has completely gone, and that they'd rather all have blankets than get their fellow cellmate out of solitary confinement. The study is said to have ended prematurely for 2 reasons. One being that they'd realised the extent to which the sadistic behaviour of the guards had increased. This was through videotapes that they'd seen from the night time when the guards thought that the researchers weren't watching. The humiliation and the punishments turned somewhat pornographic, and it's thought that the boredom of the guards just escalated the punishments that the prisoners had to endure. The second reason that the study ended was because a recent PhD graduate, Christina Maslach, came to visit the prison, and she was horrified by what she saw. She thought, what is happening to these poor boys, and said to Zimbardo that he has to end it, and that he's no longer a psychological researcher here, that he's been engulfed by it. And I think that made Zimbardo realise how emerged he'd become in his role as the chief guard, and that was another reason why he felt that he needed to end it prematurely on the 6th day. And I think that it was definitely good that it did end, and that it probably should have ended a bit sooner, because by the sounds of what the prisoners had to endure, it should never happen in a research study. To end the study on the last day, the researchers, guards and prisoners all had a debrief where they spoke about how they felt and their experiences, just to get everything out in the open, and to talk about the experiment in general and look at their morals and their decisions, and to better equip them for behaving differently in the future. The study was terminated on August the 20th in 1971. The main conclusion that was drawn from this study is that it wasn't the personality traits of the individuals that caused this behaviour, it was the simulated prison and the authority complex that led to this behaviour in the guards, and also the gradual commitment of the behaviours of the guards and the punishments, and the fact that they were allowed to do this and that the researchers didn't intervene at many points just made the guards escalate their behaviour. And it just goes to show the power of authority. It also aligns with the results from the very famous experiment, the Milgram experiment, where random participants complied with an authority figure's commands to shock other participants with lethal electricity shots that they thought were actually being given to the other participants. Even when the other participants were clearly in pain, they would administer the shocks as they were ordered to by the authority figure, the researcher in the situation. It just goes to show the power that authority can have over an individual. As you're probably aware by now, this study involves really questionable ethics. If this study was carried out now, it would definitely not be allowed. The main ethical issue being that even when the participants were showing signs of extreme distress and wanting to withdraw from the study, they weren't allowed to. Despite the fact that they were told that they had the right to leave at any time, they weren't allowed to, which goes against so many ethical guidelines that we have today, and a lot of ethical guidelines with human studies were put into place after this study came out due to the considerable amount of distress that the participants had to endure. Along with the many ethical issues that come with the study, there are also many criticisms. Selection bias may play a part in this study, as the ad specifically stated that the study was for prisoners and guards, and this could mean that a certain type of person would apply to the study. Furthermore, demand characteristics may play a role, as participants are more likely to act and behave in a way that they think the researchers want them to. So maybe the prisoners and the guards acted like stereotypically how they thought prisoners and guards would act in these situations. This study is impossible to replicate as it's based on subjective accounts, and the variables become lost within the study, so it would be impossible to reproduce this. So it is hard to definitively say that it is the prison situation itself rather than the individuals that led to this behaviour. This study does have very important real-world applications, as it has been seen before in real life, such as Abu Ghraib, where guards completely took advantage of their roles and subjected prisoners to horrendous abuse, and there is much that can be learned from this study. And a positive takeaway from this is that the study did give rise to change within prisons. I do believe that there is still a long way to go with the prison guard dynamic in the real world today, but I definitely think that this experiment does shine light on the inadequacies of the authoritarian roles within prisons, and can definitely gives interesting insights into what variables can cause people to act in certain ways when placed into situations like this. Thank you for listening to my summary of the Stanford Prison Experiment. Hope that you've enjoyed this video and that you've learned a bit more about this really famous experiment, as well as all of the questionable things about this experiment. And I hope that you have a bit more of an insight into the psychological effects of the prison environment. So thank you so much for watching.